Hi. Anybody that knows me knows I like cooking, baking, and all that good domestic goddess stuff. But what I have conversated with a lot of my friends with was that some people were curious how the canning process goes. So what we're going to be doing is trying to do it down and dirty, simple canning ideas, recipes, something to inspire maybe some creativity. But first things first, when you ever going to endeavor to do something, make sure you have everything that you need, because this is not a process that you want to get in the middle of and find that you're missing something. So at the very least, for water bath canning, which is what we're going to be doing today, make sure you have a big enough pot for the jars. And in today's purposes, we're going to be using quart jars to be able to go into. We can also use pint jars. And in order to be able to sufficiently do a water bath and get the outcome that you need, you also need to make sure that the water's deep enough that you have at least about an inch or so above the lids, so you have complete submersion of the jar as well as the lids. Now, when you are doing water bath canning, it's not just the pot, but also make sure you have one of these. It's like a cage in a way that you put your jars in, and then it nestles down into the water. The purpose is you don't want complete contact of your jar with the bottom of the pot while it's doing its water bath boil. You're not going to be doing this for a long period of time, but just long enough to get the temperature of the jars up and to have the seals make sure that they set really good once the jar is out and cooling. So you would possibly, you can do this, start this on the counter and lower it by the handles, or if you feel confident enough, go ahead and have this in the water and then place your jars in it. But always make sure that you have enough water that the lids will be covered when everything is all said and done. Now, that being said, that's after. What we are doing today is we're going to be doing peaches that came from our own peach tree out in the yard. And they're a bit on the smaller side, but they are just as flavorful, if not more so, than your traditional bigger peaches that you can get at farms or markets. Food for thought, no pun intended. Any fruits or veg that you get at the market, you can also do this whole process with, if you happen to be in a limited capacity to find a local farmer's market or a farm that you can go pick yourself or grow yourself. So these just happen to be ones from our own peach tree that we're going to use today so they don't go to waste. Also, besides your canning pot and your metal basket to be able to put them in, you want your jars. Brand specific does not matter, as long as they are clean, no chips. Make sure the lip of the jar is nice and solid and complete. You don't want chips or cracks, because then the seal of the lid won't be solid and you won't get a good fitting for it, and it just will go to waste, or it might even potentially explode when you try to take it out of the water bath because of the pressure and that's on the inside as well as the outside. Now today we're using our own jars that we've had that we perpetually reuse because we do so many canning projects. So we're able to recycle our jars. But if you need to, you can also use the Ball brand that come prepackaged with lids and bands. These are called regular mouth. And then there's also wide mouth jars that obviously are bigger that you can use. And obviously it doesn't matter size or style of jar. It can be smooth, it can be decorative, it can be what they call quilted, textured, whatever have you. As long as you have a proper size lid, proper size band, and a clean jar. Now, to make life a little bit easier, if you have a dishwasher, pop your jars into the dishwasher. Even if they are prepackaged like this, go ahead and pop them in there to get the jars nice and warm. Having a jar pre-warmed before you put your product into it, then into a water bath, will help with the glass not expanding and contracting too quickly, causing possible cracks or an issue with a seal. You can also put them in a really hot sink of really, really warm water, just as long as you know that they're going to be clean. And so that when you get them out, the jars are still warm. It's very helpful in the canning process. Now, the jars that we're using today, I've already run them through the dishwasher, so they're still kind of warm, and they do the process just fine. With our peaches, we have them skinned when we can them. So what we're going to do is we're going to do basically a quick flash boil in some hot water to help loosen the skin. And once we get it out, we throw it in an ice bath, basically water really, really cold water with maybe some ice in it, or if you just have really exceptionally cold water, that should work too. The key is you want to make sure your water stays nice and cold. You can also do this with any other vegetable or fruit that has a skin on it that you don't want, maybe like fig or plum or tomatoes. Tomatoes is a really big one. If you don't want skins in your crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, whatever you're making, same process works. You only need to take it and put them in hot water that you do want to get to at least a nice mild boil. It doesn't have to be a big rolling boil, but at least something that's a boiling matter. Now, you can put in as many as you like, and if your water is way too hot for you to be able to effectively get these in so they can start getting submerged, then you can go ahead and use a ladle or strainer type thing to lower it in there. And as far as how long, it's going to be basically you gauging by looking and feeling on the looseness of the skin, and usually how easy it might be to be able to come off will depend on what it is. With these peaches, they're a little bit on the thicker skin side and probably really a lot firmer, so it will end up maybe taking a little bit longer than it would, say, a tomato who is thinner skinned. This is where I'm going to start. So we've gotten these in here. They've been in here for collectively maybe about 5 or so minutes. And I take some out and I can sit here and take my finger, even just with the pad of my finger, not even the nail, and I can feel the skins coming loose. So I'm going to give that one more minute. But there are some that are a little bit more down. You don't have to fill your pot as much as I did, but I figured might as well just get these done and over with. You can do just a few at a time and get a feel for how much it's going to be able to take to be efficient enough for you. Now, all we're doing is simply having this light boil going on and throw them in there. Let them sit in the cold water for at least a few minutes. That way the shock of the cold water will cause the meat to contract and the skin to come more physically loose from the actual peach. So that's all we're doing with these guys, is throwing them in after just a few minutes in a really hot bath. And yeah, I can feel all these guys have softened up. Like I said, it's a look, it's a feel. Some skins might already start coming loose from it. If you can tolerate the warmth of it, they're not really scalding your skin. But if you can't tolerate the warmth of it, kind of go, obviously these ones are already peeling, which is fine. And these ones are also pretty darn soft. You don't have to sit there and submerge your hand in the pot to feel them. Just bring them out, give them a feel, see how loose the skin feels under your texture. And obviously we can visibly see that these are doing just what we need them to do. Stop. Boom. Okay, now that we've had these in our cold water for a few minutes, the water itself has gotten a little bit more lukewarm, which is not the end of the world, but I definitely don't want it to get any hotter. So if you want, you can dump out the warm water and add a little bit more cold to kind of emphasize a bit more of that cold contrast. Now with these, the skins actually came loose enough that it peels off fairly easy. If you do find, if you're using a fruit or a veg that you're trying to do the skinning process with, and has a few spots that might hang up a little bit or cling, just grab yourself a peeling knife and then you can just sit there and nub it off if you want to, or if you feel like a little bit more adventurous, just go ahead. If you got nails, have to it. And so that is our peach, all peeled and ready to go. And then later on, after we get all of these done, we will pit them. And we're going to do these in a simple syrup kind of way as far as canning. We're not going to endeavor to flavor these. But if you did want to have flavored peaches or any other fruit, really, you could do your apples, you can do plums and apricots and such. You can add your own spices like some nutmeg or some cinnamon. A lot of our peach ones that we've done in the past, we actually have added cinnamon sticks to, so that they can sit in there with jars with the peaches and kind of flavor it as they sit and cure, for lack of a better word. Stop. Okay, so next step after we've boiled our peaches down to loosen the skins, we've peeled them. No, your fruit is not going to be picture magazine perfect. Don't ever expect it to be. We're going for function. I'm going for flavor, not camera picture perfect. So we've skinned them, left them there, have not pitted them yet. Did go ahead and put some that we did the other day in a pot to get warmed up and bring it back up to temp. The premise of this is after we pit these, we're going to be putting them in a pot. Preferably use steel if you have steel. Do not use aluminum when you are doing anything as far as if you're cooking down whatever you're going to be canning with. As also with anything product you're going to be mixing with, stirring with, use something steel. Even if it's like a ladle, you can use for when you're going to scoop this out to put it into the jars. You want to use steel. Aluminum reacts a lot of times, especially if you're doing tomatoes or anything with an acidic base, it reacts very poorly with aluminum. Now, while we have that warming up, I also have this warming up because I want to get this to a nice boil. It doesn't have to be a big rolling boil, but at least an active boil. And that's going to take a little bit of time. So that gives me time to get these up to temp. And if I wanted to flavor it a little bit with maybe some brown sugar or cinnamon, that's fine. For today's purposes, we're going to add just a little bit of sugar to make it a bit of a simple syrup concept. Because right now I have the juice from all the peaches in there, which is plenty of juice. And once the temperature gets in, it's going to render a lot more of the juice out of the meat. And so that's my liquid portion. So then I'm going to add a little bit of sugar. You can use brown sugar, you can use cane sugar, any sugar components that will help add a sweetness to it, but also sugar when it cooks down adds a little bit of a syrupy consistency to it, which makes it also helpful if you're going to be using these later on for baking or for eating on the side, say like some people like fresh canned peaches with ice cream or as a dessert itself or to add to cereals. While that's warming up, I'm also going to be putting my lids in a small pot of water. Again, I don't need this a rolling boil, but I do need it actively steaming, so I know that it's up to temp. So like with this one in the back, we have it set on a low setting, about 1 or 2 as far as my oven is concerned, so that it's getting nice and warm, because the concept is the warm water is going to be softening the inside rubber of the lid, and that is what is important. So when it sits on your jar and you put the band on, it creates a mold within the rubber seal that is specific to that jar, which enables a good, perfect, solid, full contact seal, instead of it just being plain raw metal on glass, which won't give you a good proper seal. So if you want, you could put all of these in there. It doesn't really matter as long as they're getting submerged. I usually put them in one at a time, but you can layer it so you don't have to do them one at a time. As far as getting them warmed up to temp process, I have 9 of these going in, so they can sit there and get nice and warmed, and they can stay in there. It's not like it's going to cook the rubber or anything, just as long as they're kept warm and malleable, so it'll have a nice physical contact with the glass top. These are cooking down. These are the peaches we just did, and as far as, since these are getting nice and warm, I'm going to turn this down because I don't need it scorched, because then that'll end up with a sour sugar taste. You want it just warmed up. The concept of putting them in a pot and warming them down is also a twofold, besides rendering some of the sugar and the juices out to help add to the flavor. And if I wanted to add some more different kind of flavors along with it, it also helps counter any bacteria possibility. Heat kills bacteria, so that helps also with the process of our peaches not basically fermenting or going soured even after being canned, which can happen.
Good.
Okay, so what we did is we pitted our peaches, and recommendation, either do it over a big wide mouth bowl or a good cookie sheet that has a good lip to it, at least 1 inch deep, because as you can see, a lot of the natural juice comes out with the fruit between the skinning and the pitting process. Be mindful with peaches now when you are doing the pitting process. They do have a bit of a point on one end and can sometimes poke your finger, which is not a pleasant feeling. So what we are doing is we are adding in our peaches. We are not making peach jam or anything preserves. We are just doing basically stewed peaches. So what we are doing is adding in them whole. Now, if you wanted to do like a jam purpose with peaches, then you would just put them in still like this. And if you have something like a potato masher, something with a blunt bottom to it, that you can sit there and macerate with it. Or if you have a really good food processor, blender at home, blenders work really good too. Cook them down to where you want them nice and really super soft, and then just scoop them out, put them in a nice clean blender, mash it on down to the consistency that you're looking for as far as if you're making a jam. And then you can just put it back in the pot either to bring it up to temp, or if you're doing it in small batches, you can just take it straight from the blender and pour it into your jars. Now, for our purposes, I was trying to emphasize the use of steel pots, steel utensils for acidic things, especially when it comes to tomatoes. Now, because I'm using fruit and I'm not too worried about the acidity component of it, even though, yes, fruit does have acid in it, I also like using wooden utensils because wooden still also does just fine. It doesn't interact with the acidity or the flavor of what I am cooking down. Now, this pot is a bit fuller than what I care for it to be, but I wanted to try to get all of it done as far as getting this process going and getting them done. Now, with these guys, you can add some sugar to it, like I was saying before, some kind of sugar component, whether it be honey, maple, coconut sugar, regular sugar, anything that you want to sweeten it if it's not already naturally sweet enough for you. Some fruits don't need any sugar added to them at all. Strawberries tend to be really, really flavorful as far as the sweetness consistency goes. So basically just grab yourself a spoon, maybe give it a few minutes to warm up, because also heat will change the flavor profile of whatever it is you're getting warmed up ready for canning. That goes for any fruit and actually probably for some vegetables. It changes the flavors a bit. So maybe take a little taste of that and see if the sugar sweetness consistency is what you're looking for. If not, go conservatively with your sweetener, whatever it is you're adding into it. Do little bits at a time. Put some in, stir it around, give it a minute to macerate and blend up with whatever it is that you're planning on canning fruit-wise, and then just kind of do it in baby steps, because once you add too much, you can't take that away. The only way you can balance that out is by adding more to your pot as far as whatever fruit component it is you're cooking up. So for our purposes, because later on I use these for peach cobblers, peach pies, peach blueberry mix pies and such, I don't want to add any sugar to it before I can it. After I take them out of the jars to use them for whatever I'm going to be baking is when I'll be adding my sweetener to it. So for right now purposes, the natural sweetness that the peach already has, which to me is fine, it's nice and mild, is plenty for what I'm going to use it for. As far as everybody else, if you're going to be making peach preserves, peach jam, whatever have you, sugar adding while you're cooking before you can is probably more ideal. Now, also keep in mind, if you're going to use this as a jam preserve concept, where you go and you cook it down and you mash it up and puree it, then to get it consistent, sugar will also add a little bit of syrupy consistency to it, so a little bit thicker than just your basic water. But there also is different things called pectin that people use as far as jams and sugars, preservatives and stuff like that, as far as for spreadable fruit spreads. Now there's the original, there's instant, there's liquid, there's dry, there's powder. Everybody has their own preference as far as what they like to use. This just basically helps kind of thicken up the consistency of the liquid component. Now, it's not going to make whatever's in the pot gel up immediately in the pot. That comes after with the cooling effect after it's been put in the jars. The way you can tell is, like, this is our blueberry, and I don't know if you guys can see it there or not, but like when I put it on its side, I can still see that the jelly itself, the jam, is not moving. So that tells me that I had an adequate amount in there to make it thicken up to the consistency of the jam that I wanted it to be. Everybody's different as far as how thick or thin they like their preserves, especially when it comes to fruit spreads. You can also do apple butters and stuff like that. Cooking fruit down renders a lot of the sugar out and also takes off a lot of the moisture with the steam. So just the simple act of cooking it down will also thicken up your consistency. The Sure Gel, and actually there's probably some other generic brands out there I'm sure that other people have used or heard of, will give you a quicker turnaround as far as the thickening component. But for our purposes, all we're doing is we're stewing these up, and we're just doing a simple straight canning process of putting them in the jars and keeping them around for future recipes that these will be ingredients in. Now, as you are cooking down either your fruit or your vegetable, a lot of times you'll end up seeing a foam that comes up. And again, this doesn't have to be at a big rolling boil, just a nice, really good, consistent, pretty warm. If you're seeing steam coming off of it, that's a good temperature. Because if you end up, especially if it has something naturally sugary in it, you don't want it too hot because you actually can cook the sugar component in it, and that will change the flavor completely. But as I was saying, you see this foam that comes up around, and that's actually the fruit's natural acid that is coming out of this from the heating process. So what a lot of people tend to do, personal preference, obviously, it's not a necessity, but a lot of people will keep this going, keep it warm for a little while to render up as much of the foam as they can, and then you can just take it off there. The purpose is a lot of people feel, and I'm kind of a similar mind, that the foam, the acid, can actually keep it having a bit of a little acidic, bitter taste to it on the flavor. So what you can do is by physically removing that acid, which is the foamy part, it takes at least that extra component of tartness out of it. Now, you can do this for 10 minutes, you can do this for 20 minutes, however long you want to cook them down, that's fine, depending on what you're going to use them for. The longer they cook, obviously the softer they get. So if you want a good firm peach, like if you're trying to use them for cobblers or pies later on, then you probably don't want to cook it for too horribly long. Usually I'll cook them to where I know I'm actively getting some of this acid foam, as I refer to it anyway, off of it, so at least it'll help render the flavor a little bit more sweeter and maybe not quite as acidic. Always also be sure, don't let your pot just sit. Keep on moving it around. You don't want to have a spot where something might get accidentally scorched if it's too warm on the bottom. And plus, by evenly and consistently stirring it, you're also ensuring that everything inside is getting distributed with the heat evenly as possible. So you're getting a similar consistency throughout everything that you have in your pot. And then plus the physical action of stirring it around sometimes helps render up some more of that foam acid that a lot of us tend to try to get rid of, so that it lends for a bit different, a little bit better, different flavor profile. Everybody has their own preference. Stop. Okay, so we've gotten through the process of cooking them down a little bit to help render off some of that extra foamy acid. I'm not going to be able to completely get all of the acid off of it, but at least as I got as much as I felt like I could to at least help with the flavor profile of what I'm going for, because I really want to have a true peach taste, not just a sugary, tarty kind of flavor going on. I like to actually have my fruits taste like fruit. After we've gotten these cooked down, these have been going for about 10 minutes. They're nice and consistent, so I can go ahead and turn them off because they're going to stay warm for the duration of what it's going to take me to fill up the jars. Still have my lids going at a nice warm. I can actually turn them off now because that's also going to stay warm long enough for what I'm going to be doing. Also, besides the tools of the basket for this, and preferably if you have one of these, it helps filling your jars a lot easier, less mess. If you feel like you have a steady enough hand that you can ladle straight into the jar with minimal or no mess, go for it. Not an absolute necessity to have these, Plastic or metal, doesn't matter. They work just fine, but this just helps keep the mess quotient down. Now, that being said, also when it comes to the lids, if you either don't have one of these, which is a long stick with a magnet on the end, so you can pick your lids up out of the water bath, like so, a little bit easier. You could also use something like rubber tongs. The point is you don't really want to scratch or make an imperfection in the rubber part of the lid. So you want to try to keep it as malleable as possible. So you can use one of these to help pick up one of the lids, or like I said, a rubber tipped tongs to help kind of grab them up. They are going to be very warm to the touch, but you should still be able to handle them without burning your fingers. In regards to heat, FYI, anytime you're doing anything like this, because this obviously takes longer than what you guys are seeing, this total duration probably will take about an hour to an hour and a half. You don't want to do it in the middle of a really hot day. If you can stand to do it, preferably early in the morning or later in the evening when it's cooled off, better for it because you get a lot of moisture and steam and heat from the stove. Or on a nice cooler rainy day like we're doing today, even though it's in the middle of the day, it's still temperature-wise not too hot. But this whole process creates a lot of heat in your kitchen. Great if you want to do it on a cold day to warm up the kitchen. But either way, just make sure that you're prepared for the duration from start to finish, not stopping, because this is a process that you really need to kind of keep going. So then what we're doing is I can ladle out some of the meat and some of the juice along with it. But for right now, for our purposes, I want to get as much meat, fruit, pulp, whatever you want to call it, in the jars as possible. So I ladle up some of the meat, maybe with a little bit of juice, and plop it in. Now keep in mind, this is going to make the jar really get warm again. Even if they've started to cool off a little bit, that's okay. The heat from this process is also going to warm the jar back up. So then what we're going to do is fill the jars up as much as we can, and obviously some juice is still getting in there with it, which is perfectly fine. Now if you wanted yours to have a whole bunch of juice, you could also ladle up some of the juice itself from the pot and then just add just the juice to keep it nice and moist and squishy. You always want to make sure you get a little bit of what they call head space in your jar when you fill it up. You don't want to fill it up all the way to the brim. At the very most, to probably where the neck of it starts, and it on the flange of the jar is the most, because when you put them in the water bath, you're going to have some pressure building up on the inside, which is going to cause expansion, and you don't want to be all the way to the tippy top, because then there's no room for that pressure to go anywhere, and you end up with a big mess that actually can end up hurting somebody. Now after you've put your jar and filled it up, find yourself a clean rag. It can be a little damp, it can be dry, doesn't matter, but what you're going to do is you're going to go around the edge of the jar, making sure that there is no residue, no syrup, or any pieces of fruit that might have clung to it, because you want it as smooth and clean as possible. Also, keep your hands clean. If you get a little messy along the way, stop and wash your hands. Don't want any cross-contamination, bacteria, or anything like that getting into this process, because even though we're using a lot of heat and processing and pressuring with the water bath canning, we also don't want to introduce any bacteria or foreign matter in the process that could cause a bit of a rotting fermentation process on the inside of the jar. So then we wipe off the lid and go and grab one of our jar lids. Now it's okay if it's a little bit of moist. It's not going to be the end of the world, because actually that'll end up separating out. Set your lid where you want it. Hold it, because once you get it on there, it's going to start to form that seal. It's going to mold around the conformation of that specific jar. You would think everything would be uniform as far as jars are concerned, but actually there is usually a little difference between each jar. They are not always 100% consistently the same. So you want to make sure what lid you put on this jar is the lid just going to stay there. So I usually hold it with my finger and just put the lid on. Make sure it's on there good. Then I can tolerate heat a little bit better than most people. If you want, hold it with a rag, but you want to hold firmly to your jar. And it's one thing to screw the lid down. That's just a simple hand tightening, but you really want to make sure you crank down on that ring. You want to make sure you have a good solid seal, physically touching and wound down so that there's no deviation. If you accidentally cross thread your ring, hold your lid if you can and try to loosen the ring back it up a little bit, but keeping your lid in place. So then reset your ring, retighten it down. You should give it a good crank. If you got somebody with you that has a little bit stronger hands than you do, if you don't feel like you have a good enough hand strength, ask them to go behind you and give it a little bit of extra torque on it. So you want to make sure that it's nice and there's no possible way that it could go slip or any air could possibly come and push it off, as the pressure on the inside of the jar is going to start pushing on the outside. The water bath itself, from the heat in the water itself, is at the same time going to be pushing in on it. That's what helps create that pancaking kind of seal. So once you get that lid on, once you get the ring on, give it a good crank. And then during this whole process, we've had this going so it's nice and hot. It's at a very mild boil. So I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. I can see the water rolling, which means basically moving. It doesn't have to be an active bubble or anything like that. And then what I tend to do is with mine, I will go ahead and after I've gotten that tightened down by hand, I can put it on there. Now once we get this filled up, I can pick it up, plop it down in, and then time it. Now keep in mind, everything, vegetable or fruit, has a little bit of variation as far as time goes, depending on temperature, time, your pot itself, and keeping that temperature consistent. That's the key. You want consistent temperature. That's why we bring this up to a boil and not put these in and then try to bring it up to a boil. So we'll do that and get that going in a few minutes. I usually leave it in for anywhere from about maybe 7 to 10 minutes, really no longer than 10 minutes, because I don't need to create so much pressure that it warps the lid. This is just a certain amount, enough to build up some pressure on the inside, warm the contents of it on the inside enough so that everything's all nice and heated up, so and killing any bacteria possibly that could be around. Then once I release it out, the lid itself might be a little convex, mean having a little bit of a bubble to it. That's perfectly normal. What I don't want to see is any imperfections in the lid itself. Even though it might be raised a little bit in the middle, I don't want to see any dents or blemishes, if I can help it, in the lid. Because once it starts cooling, the suction on the inside, because everything's going to start contracting back down, is going to pull that bubble down. It's going to pull this back down flush, and you'll hear an audible pop at the end. That's how you know your seals have set and it has a perfectly good sealed lid. Ready. Okay, so now we've gotten through about a 7-8 minute boil, low boil, not really a rapid boil as far as our water bath is concerned. Now, if you want to, you can grab the handles of your basket and just pull it up and out and be able to place them over on a heat safe surface area. Or if you have these are a very handy tool. You could find just about anywhere, Walmart, Tractor Supply, ag store. And you can gently put it around the neck of the jar. Slowly pull your jars out, just in case you have that one little sneaky that didn't have a good seal. Because the last thing you want is really hot contents basically exploding on your hand. Been there, done that.
Or your ceiling.
Yeah, or the ceiling. Been there, done that. So for our purposes, we can use these to pull the grate out, or these. I prefer using this myself. Now, while you're doing this, take your pot off the active heat source. That way you're still not producing a whole bunch of more heat and lessening you basically getting too much heat and getting hot yourself. Because this is a really warm process between the steam and everything cooking on top of the stove. Now be careful while you're grabbing your jars out as some may shift around a little bit. So make sure you have a really good grip on them when you're pulling them out, because sometimes these might be a little bit slippery if you don't have really good full contact around the neck of the jar. So pull them out gently so you don't drop them back down, which can cause possibly a crack, which I've also done that, unfortunately, as well. Learn from experience, right? And there you have it. Now, with your jars, make sure they're on a heat tolerant surface so that you're not sitting there melting or damaging whatever you might be resting it on. Now, I don't know if you guys can see it from here, but these are raised a little bit. So that little bit of raise tells me that good temperature, good heat built up on the inside, and that then in about anywhere, depending on how big and how packed your jar is, it can take anywhere from 30 minutes to almost an hour for them to start cooling enough to where it'll affect the pressure on the inside negatively and pull that bubble back down, which creates more of a mechanical seal for your jars. Other than that, your inspiration and your imagination is limitless. You can do this with any fruits or vegetables. Now, keep in mind, water bath canning is not for every recipe. Look and make sure, cross-reference check your information if something is requesting a pressure cooker, because some things, especially like your bland vegetables like green beans, zucchini, squashes, and such like that, do require a pressure cooker. I find a lot of things that have a natural acidity to them do fine in the water bath as far as preservation, so I don't have to worry about it going bad. But otherwise, that's your end product. It keeps for months on end. We usually, about this time of year, do a lot of apples, peaches, and preserves and such, because it keeps and makes for great Christmas or birthday presents over winter, and especially when fruit is hard to come by that actually tastes like fruit during winter up here in New England. It's nice to be able to get it seasonally so you can get as much of that flavor and be able to enjoy it throughout the rest of winter, as our winters tend to be a little bit on the longer side. So in the meantime, can away, enjoy, and have fun. Thanks for watching.